and thank you very much for being with us today. Since many of our participants today are about to graduate from universities, so could you please start to introduce what were your goals upon graduating from university, and how did you identify your career interests?
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to join you and happy to learn more about your organization and the work you're doing. And I'll be happy to share a little bit about my background in hopes that others can learn from some of the experiences that I had, some of the decisions that I made. And one thing that I hope comes across from some of the things that I'll share is that I did not always anticipate or have in mind ahead of time some of the decisions that I would make or some of the opportunities that I would have. But I think as well as planning, and planning is very important, and we'll talk about that, there's also an importance for recognizing an opportunity that might not have been planned or might not have been anticipated, and thinking about how to respond to that. So for my earliest decision-making, both around making the decision to go to college and in choosing a field of study, I went to a large public research university, Penn State University. I wasn't totally sure that I would attend this kind of large institution. I also was looking for my undergraduate college attendance at smaller liberal arts colleges and fields of study that were offered at those institutions that would kind of be more consistent with a traditional arts and sciences curriculum. So when I was making the transition from high school into college, I had some interest in things like finance and investments. But while I was looking at attending a liberal arts college, that sort of institution might not have had a degree in finance, might not have had a business curriculum as we would think of it, but did have, or these institutions typically do offer programs of study in economics. So my thought process in looking at economics was tied up into some of that experience of looking at a particular set of institutions. So Penn State offered curriculum in economics in addition to some of the business curriculum or fields like finance. But my thought process had kind of independently or separately from choosing an institution been focused on choosing that particular field of study, and I had become quite interested in studying economics, both in terms of some of the private applications, but also around things like public policy. And I was able to follow up on some of those interests during my time as an undergraduate student, thinking about participating in coursework and learning about the field of study of economics. And over those years, particularly due to the influence of some of my faculty members, some of the individuals who taught me and advised me, I really started thinking very seriously about work as a faculty member or pursuing a career as a faculty member. At that time, I was thinking about a career as a faculty member in economics. So I looked to graduate study. That was one of the pathways that I was thinking about pursuing was as I was graduating college, as I was finishing college, to pursue further study in economics in hopes of kind of pursuing that career as a faculty member. And I think I'll have an opportunity to describe in a little bit more detail during our conversation. But during that time as a graduate student in economics, I had some experience outside the classroom, observing and participating to some extent in student government, university governance at Penn State, getting to see some of the institutional decision-making, and began to think about not only economics in general, but how to apply economics and that sort of thought process to the decisions that colleges and universities were making. And that academic study of economics combined with some of the extracurricular experience looking at educational administration led me to focus my doctoral degree on higher education administration. That's a track that I ended up following. And that's consistent with the sort of work that I do now, which really applies economics and economic methods and reasoning to practical problems faced by colleges and universities.
Yes. I think most of the students have discovered themselves through many different aspects before they really deciding to what to do in the future, right? So during your school days, how did you develop the skills of leadership, time management, problem solving, and other essential skills that are required in the workplace?
So I think I did this in a couple of different ways, and I can talk about a couple different experiences. One way I'd always thought of as kind of an activity or an extracurricular kind of experience, but it was really closely aligned with my academic study, and I started this while I was an undergraduate. So I had been thinking about that thought process of wanting to pursue faculty work, thinking about potentially teaching. And I knew, especially at a large public institution like Penn State that has many undergraduate students enrolled and many undergraduate students enrolled in the program of study in economics, that the department would hire undergraduate students to serve as teaching assistants. And sometimes they could do things like grade assignments or might hold study sessions, might hold review sessions. So while I was still an undergraduate, really for the last 2 years of my undergraduate time, I applied and was hired to serve as a teaching assistant for economics. So I supported a few different courses. I think that was helpful for a variety of reasons. It was something, when I was applying for graduate study in economics, it was something that I could point to say I had begun to develop some practical experience in the classroom. I was working with other students. I was helping other students to prepare for their exams or to learn the material. It definitely helped me with time management. It was something additional that I needed to account for in my own time and in my own responsibilities on top of my existing coursework. I also needed to manage that well. It really helped me to get to know faculty members better. So I was working directly for a couple of faculty members as a teaching assistant. So I got to know them personally, and I got to see how they prepared their courses and their teaching. And I also got to know the individuals who were doing the hiring, the individuals who were supporting the department administration. I got to work with those individuals, and it gave me experience. That was probably my first experience working in the classroom with students, helping students to work through material, helping students to prepare, which probably has even influenced to now, where I am in my career as a faculty member, influenced me in my preparation to teach. I would say a separate kind of experience that helped in a different way was that, and this really influenced my eventual decision to focus on college and university administration as a topic that I think about. Both during my time as an undergraduate student and as a graduate student, I participated in different capacities in student government at the institution. As an undergraduate, I was a representative of my academic college to a broader university-wide student government organization. So I got to think about how that sort of advocacy worked, how there was some interplay between students and the administration and formulating academic policies or thinking about student satisfaction, thinking about student issues. And as a graduate student, so it turned out that I stayed at the same institution to pursue graduate study from where I had been as an undergraduate student. And I had developed some of that awareness, developed some of that familiarity by participating in student government as an undergraduate student. I think given some of that, I had some experience to build on. I had an opportunity to have some deeper experience or deeper awareness from that participation as a graduate student, and really got to feel like I was seeing some of the main issues or some of the main questions that college and university administrators were trying to solve. And I kind of absorbed that into the things that I was thinking about as a graduate student, looking for research questions, looking for projects. I really became interested in the practical applications of some of the things that I was seeing through student government, and thinking about, well, how do these issues affect other institutions? How could this be generalized into research? And it became a very large interest of mine, and something that I continue to think about even now.
Okay, great. So I also believe that teaching assistant, this kind of job, can definitely help a student to develop different types of skills. Could you please also tell us more about your two jobs at institution of higher education, and what was your thinking process in developing a short-term or long-term career?
Yes, so I think I can identify a thread that runs from my undergraduate study to graduate study into the first job that I held into the career that I currently hold. When I was finishing my graduate study, so this was about, so I finished my undergraduate degree in 2007, spent 2 years in graduate study in economics, and then 4 years in higher education. So I was leaving Penn State. I was leaving my graduate program about 6 years after I had finished my undergraduate degree. So I was leaving the same institution that I attended, but this was a little bit later after I had done these graduate degrees. And at that point, I really applied for two different kinds of jobs. I applied for a large number of positions. I applied for positions across a wide geographic range in different parts of the US. I had focused my job search on positions in the US, but I applied to broadly to different regions of the country. And I was applying for two types of positions. So the first were jobs that look very similar to the job that I have now, and those were faculty positions at the entry level or assistant professor level in higher education administration programs, and that's essentially the position that I hold now. But in addition to responding to calls or job postings for that kind of position, I was also applying for a different type of job. And that I can summarize as more research-focused positions, research analyst type of positions in a variety of different settings. Many of these were research centers that were academic research centers that were affiliated with colleges and universities. Some of these research analyst positions worked directly for colleges and universities as part of their personnel or as part of their research staff, conducting projects or conducting self-assessment kinds of studies or carrying out reports directly for colleges and universities. And I applied for a mix of these sorts of analyst positions, but one in particular that attracted my attention was this position at a place called the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University. And at that time, that center had a couple of different kinds of focus areas for research. One of the focus areas was looking at teacher policy, recruitment and retention for teachers, for how large public school districts in the US or at the state level, how state departments of education could attract and develop and retain teachers. And another focus area of the research was around students' transitions into college. So moving from these kinds of school districts, or kind of looking broadly at students moving from public K-12 education in the state to looking at their transitions to college. That was a focus area, and that was consistent with this interest that I had developed at Penn State, thinking about affordability of college or thinking about students' access to colleges and universities. So I looked at the research program or the research goals for the center. And I really found, especially that component was very consistent with what I was thinking about, and that I could have something to offer and that I could learn from the experience. So I applied there, I interviewed, I was offered a position there, and I served in that role as part of the research staff at that center for just a little over 3 years. So after I finished my graduate degree, I served in that position for a little over 3 years. And it involved working with other members of the research staff. It involved talking with some of the partners, either at the school district agency partners or state education department agency partners, to understand their needs, understand their interests, and really try to target our research projects and our research efforts to the questions that they were interested in learning more about. And that, I think, positioned me well. I learned quite a bit from that experience about my own work. I learned about how I go about research, how I go about doing research now. But I also really got to see some of this research in action of working with partners in practice, working with agencies to really solve kind of pressing and current problems of practice. When I found out about an opening for a faculty position at West Virginia University, I really thought that would be an opportunity to try to put some of this experience that I had into action, to try to build a relationship working with a state partner, to work with a state agency, to answer some of these questions about transitions to college. For as much as I could learn, that was something that was really of interest, something that was kind of pressing and identified to be important in the state of West Virginia. So I felt like that was something I had some experience seeing, something I knew about and had seen in practice that I could try to bring there. And it also called back to the longer term interest that I had in serving in a faculty position, serving in a faculty role. So in that instance, I did take that offer of a position and started as an assistant professor of higher education administration in West Virginia. And I have been in that role for almost 3 years. But I think we can sort of look back and see some of those interests and where they developed and how they led me to that point. But I really feel like I consistently draw on the experiences I had in the research center, the experiences that I had from my graduate and undergraduate experiences that inform the work that I'm doing now.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes, for sharing your career experience. Could you please give some suggestions for students who want to find an academic research job or internship at universities? And what are researchers' professional qualities?
Sure. So I think especially for the kind of research that I've been describing, the kind of research that I do myself, I can describe some of these skills or some of these practices that will be very useful for students to have. I don't want to suggest that this generalizes to other kinds of research, like in the natural sciences or in other kinds of fields, but for the sort of thing that I've described, especially understanding educational administration, educational practice from a researcher's perspective, I think this will speak to that sort of experience. So I'll start from the top right and move around. So I'll start by describing technical ability. And in my case, and for the kind of work that I'm describing, I'm thinking of this body of work that is informed by the field of study of economics and can be applied to a variety of public policy kinds of questions, but in my case is typically kind of referred to as the economics of education or economics applied to questions of educational policy. So the technical ability there is largely quantitative and is sort of consistent with ability in using economic methods to conduct research, including the ability to make sense of data sources, the ability to judge the accuracy of data sources, but then also to carry out analyses, maybe carry out statistical analyses, be able to judge or assess the accuracy of those analyses, and to be able to draw accurate interpretations around research findings and to understand the results of research. So those technical skills, the kind that might be reinforced or presented in programs of study like economics or statistics, to some extent psychology and sociology. These are those sorts of technical skills involved with research. Another one that I have thought a lot about, which goes beyond just the research methods or goes beyond the technical side of the work, is thinking about identifying questions to ask, or identifying what sorts of questions to approach from a research perspective. So an analysis can be accurate, an analysis can be sound or can be conducted well, but I've found that it's very helpful and it's essential for others to have interest in the answer to the question, or for others to have interest in the results of the analysis, for it to really have importance or for it to really be desirable research. And from the perspective of educational administration, that might mean identifying questions that are of current interest or might be sources of uncertainty or maybe some policy debate or dialogue. So good questions would provide timely answers, would provide some evidence to speak to those current uncertainties or current ongoing policy debates. So I think beyond just the technical skills to be able to conduct accurate analyses, there is some awareness that can come from practical exposure, it can come from work experience, to be able to identify what kinds of questions to ask. Also in this setting, teamwork is very important, and that can be true in a variety of perspectives. So if an individual is a student participating in a research team, that can emerge even from that early stage, to be working with other students, to be working with faculty members or mentors or other research supervisors, into teams of faculty members or individuals who might work in think tanks or research centers. It's very common not for projects to be carried out by a single researcher, but for teams to be conducting these projects. And even at the faculty level, for individuals who are conducting academic research as faculty members, if we look at things like grant applications or applications for research funding, these are typically prepared and submitted by teams of researchers who will identify different parts of a project to work on or different parts of a project to contribute to. So being able to function in that kind of team environment is very helpful. And the other aspect of that, in some of the examples that I've described already, comes from a sort of partnership between researchers and practitioners. And that gets back to this idea of understanding what are the right questions or what are the good questions to be asking, what is the information that's needed. That can surface from a good partnership or good teamwork between groups of researchers and groups of practitioners. Then the final one that I would emphasize here is how to communicate findings. So not only to identify a question, work through a project, conduct an analysis in an accurate way, but also once a researcher or a team has these findings, has these results, how to help, again, in our case of educational administration, how to help decision makers make sense of that, the results, or make sense of that evidence, communicating it in a way that speaks to the original question. If it's an uncertainty, if it's a policy debate, really presents it in that language, and in a way that's accessible or understandable for an audience that might not be trained in the technical analysis. They might not understand why particular research decisions were made, but it's still upon the researcher to present that information in an accurate way to understand where it applies, if there are certain limitations or certain kind of constraints on how it should be appropriate or how it should be interpreted in an appropriate way. That takes a lot of sensitivity. It takes a lot of sensitivity in the language, which certainly makes it a skill to think about how to convey those findings in an accurate way to an audience that might be experts on something else. Like they might be experts on practice, but not necessarily the research.
Yeah, communication is always the most important thing. Dr. Hughes, could you please introduce more other career opportunities in the education industry?
Great, I'd be happy to do that. And I will try to give ideas of some of these large categories of different kinds of opportunities, different kinds of spaces that are active around these similar kinds of topics. Moving down the left first, these are consistent with the sorts of positions that I've held and that I've described here, and the sorts of work that I have looked to do myself at various points in time. So especially thinking about colleges and universities or thinking about higher education administration, almost all colleges and universities have some of their own staff members that carry out research projects, that do data reporting, that try to understand how policies might be made more effective or how institutional practices might be improved. And those are typically, those workers or those professionals are typically referred to as institutional researchers. And that is a large field in education in the United States, but would employ the kinds of tools, the kinds of research practices that I've described. I had experience in the next box working in a university-affiliated research center, which is an academic research center, not necessarily working for the university, just kind of something at the institution, might be funded by a grant or might be funded to do other sorts of projects, but is also applying similar kinds of research methods, thinking about research questions, thinking about projects, and exists to execute that program of research. The third box is similar to the work that I do now and the position that I hold now as a faculty member conducting academic research. So I, again, use a particular set of research techniques or research tradition to pursue and carry out questions looking at effectiveness of educational administration. I also have additional responsibilities around teaching and around service to my university. So that's different from working in a place where it's exclusively a research responsibility, or different from working as a staff member for the institution. So I have that kind of different set of responsibilities, but the research that I carry out in many ways looks similar to what an institutional researcher might do or what somebody might do at a center. So if we move to the second column, the green boxes, these could also be similar kinds of work, but in working in a different kind of place or working at a different type of organization. So if we think about analysts employed by state education departments, these individuals would be outside of higher education. They might ask some questions or pursue some questions that are related to colleges and universities, maybe public colleges or universities in their state, but they would be state employees who are carrying out research questions of interest for that state agency, maybe thinking about elementary or middle or high school education, maybe thinking about higher education in that state, and would have sort of that statewide focus or frame of reference for projects. Similarly, I think this sort of position would exist at larger school districts, maybe at large cities in the United States. If we think about like New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago, these types of school districts have some of their own research staff, again, to look at effectiveness of their practices, So that's not taking that state frame of reference, but might be carrying out a research agenda that's specific to that school district, even if it is a very large district. To some extent, individuals working within schools might be asking some research questions or doing some research. I think that would be less common than to see those analysts at the district level, but there could be individuals working within schools. In the third column, there are private firms that do educational evaluation or do things like program evaluation to try to conduct research to see if different kinds of educational interventions or educational policies meet their intended outcomes or deliver their intended outcomes. So there are private firms that can be contracted to do educational research. And then there are pieces of consulting activities that can resemble the kind of work that I've talked about. There are some dedicated consulting firms that look at educational administration, and there are sometimes practice areas or strands of work within broader management consulting firms that look at educational issues or that would partner with educational agencies. And then much of what I've described focuses on educational administration, thinking about the effectiveness of that administration or how to make improvements. But certainly there are individuals who work in that area who carry out those sorts of activities and might have research backgrounds or might be informed or might be educated consumers of research findings around educational administration. And these individuals may come from a legal background and carry out maybe policy or law through the perspective of a legal training. Some college or university administrators, especially higher level administrators, may be informed or may be interested in these research conversations. And there may be public policy analysts or staff that might work for state or national legislators or policy outlets that are interested in education policy that would might have some awareness of research methods that could either be conducting or consuming or reading some of these research findings. So I've tried to give a little bit of a range there of different routes people might take to approach this kind of work or this kind of research, where people with this training might pursue careers or where they might work, and what sort of different participants or stakeholders in educational administration could participate in this in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Hughes. So last but not least, could you please introduce the higher education's future trend?
Sure. So if we think about the role for this kind of space, what sort of needs there might be for this kind of work, for this kind of research, I could introduce this by identifying a few different trends. And here, I will start with a couple, starting from the top around demographics. So specifically thinking about the United States, and not consistently across the country, but in some states. So this is true. So I live in the state of Pennsylvania, and in the state of Pennsylvania, this is true, that the number of students who are graduating from high school, the age group of students who are approaching high school, who traditionally have been the largest group of students in the US who go on to college, that age group, the number of people who are in that age profile is actually getting smaller, or at least it's not growing. So that potential audience or potential group of students who might be enrolling in colleges and universities is at least not getting bigger over time. So it's not as easy for colleges and universities to recruit students who are these traditional kind of age of students who have just graduated from high school. And into the future, that's going to create a difficulty for colleges and universities to enroll enough students. At the same time, there in recent years, and there's been a lot of attention, the cost of providing a college education or a higher education has been rising. There are many potential factors that contribute to that, but a couple are things like salaries and benefits for faculty members, and providing healthcare, providing retirement, and so forth for other staff members, not just faculty members, but other staff members and administrators at colleges and universities. These sorts of healthcare costs, retirement costs have been going up. So colleges and universities have had to focus on generating enough revenue, bringing in enough money generally from tuition, to be able to cover these costs. And they also have been trying to do more and reach more students and do more research. So based on the costs and based on these activities, we've heard a lot about tuition prices at colleges and universities getting higher, and the debt or the loans that students have been taking out, or students' families have been taking out to enable them to pay for college. So both of these factors, maybe not a growing number of high school graduates that colleges and universities can recruit from, and this increasing tuition price can make it more challenging for colleges and universities to provide an affordable education, to be able to recruit students coming in the door. So I would identify this trend of enrollment management, which I think is already pretty far underway. But it would describe this effort of colleges and universities to try to be strategic about how they set their tuition prices, how they award financial aid to students, and how they recruit in different places, how they go to high schools, how they reach out to particular students. So these colleges and universities can enroll the kinds of students they want, students who they think will be successful, and students who can generate that tuition revenue for the institution. And this sort of effort, this kind of push to be strategic, has created some of the institutional research kind of job openings that I mentioned on the previous slide, thinking about this kind of institutional research as one way to work in this area, thinking about educational administration. I think these factors of demographics and price have been some of what have created this desire for colleges and universities to do this kind of work, to create these kinds of positions that are thinking about these issues and conducting research, to try to see how the institution can recruit students effectively or use financial aid awards effectively. To get to the fourth factor, which is labeled as pressure, some institutions have been able to do this more effectively than others. Some institutions are more vulnerable to these factors than others, either through the prices that they're charging, how willing students are to attend those institutions. Maybe in different parts of the country, the demographic challenges are a little bit different. So institutions are maybe facing this pressure to different extents or different amounts, and have dealt with it more or less effectively. But some institutions in particular in the US, and these tend to be smaller institutions, these tend to be institutions that depend almost exclusively on tuition revenue. So they generate their revenue from recruiting students, from enrolling students at the institution. Some of these small institutions that depend very, very heavily on tuition are closing or facing pressure to close. And if they're not responding effectively to those factors, have been in a position where it's hard for those institutions to stay open. So I think identifying that kind of pressure, identifying the stakes of this enrollment management kind of activity, have led colleges and universities to really try to think hard about how they can be strategic, how they can be effective in approaching this enrollment management kind of process. And that leads to the last factor that I've identified, called data analytics, where colleges and universities are really trying to be more sophisticated about how they use data, about how they use research, both to try to recruit students, so they're reaching out to the right students, so they're making the right kinds of offers and can kind of generate tuition revenue from enrollment, but then also so that they can enable students to be successful and enable students to stay at the institution. So they're successful early on and they can stay at the institution for multiple years to complete their programs of study. So that data analytics is not just looking at the recruitment, not just looking at the enrollment management, it's also looking at how can we provide supports or how can we reach out to students to help them to be successful so they'll stay at the institution. And I think is leading to more of these sorts of positions or more of these sorts of jobs that are informed by research, that are comfortable using data to try to look at these trends. It's informed by these kinds of factors or these kinds of pressures. But one of the ways that institutions are responding or coping with these changes is to try to use data, to try to use research. And it's creating, I think it's creating this new kind of data analyst or this need for this position to respond to these kinds of changes.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes, for sharing your opinions. For most international students, even you are not in the higher education major, I think getting to know the higher education industry is still helpful for you deciding your career and studies. Okay, so this is the end of our seminar today. We will have a small Q&A session in a few minutes. If you have any questions, please type online through Zoom or WeChat. 那么大家今天的导师的讲座内容就到这里。如果你有什么问题，可以现在通过 Zoom 或者是微信来提问，我们稍后会请导师来回答。那么在等待的同时，我就为大家简单的介绍一下我们 JobUpper 的导师领航计划。在这个领航计划里面呢，我们现在已经有接近30位像 Dr. Hughes 这样资深的，在自己的行业里面非常有建树的导师，他们愿意花自己宝贵的时间去根据同学们的不同需求，来做一个 one-on-one 的3个月的导师项目。那么这个项目会包含每2周1次的专题的交流，这个专题的交流会从职业的发展、职业的规划、职业素养的积累，甚至到学业和事业的平衡，以及如何选择未来想要进修的专业领域等等方面，来与你进行深入的讨论。同时，在这3个月里面，导师也会根据你的需求和他的专长去做一个实践项目，来支持你的努力和发展。优秀的学员也会得到导师的推荐信和其他的一些内推的机会。那么我们希望能够在这整个的12周的时间里面，导师会跟大家探讨到像在 PPT 里展示的所有的发展路径和话题，能有效的帮助到每一位学员。希望大家能够完成这个项目计划的时候呢，你就已经有了在美国的非常确切的企业实习的经历，也有力的导师的推荐信，然后能够对职业的道路有一个非常准确的认知，并且有软硬实力的这个双向积累，同时也要做到一定的人脉的拓展，这样就能在美国有一个非常好的职业开启。好，我们现在来看一下有没有同学提问。Dr. Hughes, I have a few questions here from the audience. So, yeah, so the first question is, we all kind of feel the tension between the US and the Chinese government, and it also affects the education section. Do you start to say it affects the interest of higher education institute to hire Chinese students?
So a couple responses that I would have to that is I think that education institutions are maybe a lot slower to try to contribute to that sort of tension, but also very interested in trying to preserve good relationships between the US and China. So I think that's at least one reason why institutions would be interested both in enrolling students from China, from Asia, from other countries outside the US, enrolling them as students, but then also looking at these students for sort of professional opportunities, especially given differences in skill set that they might bring or regional expertise for different parts of institutions that might specialize either in different regional studies or different sorts of technical capacities where students might be coming in with that training. But I think if we think about those international relations in general, I would say in the US, educational institutions would be positioned much more closely to trying to preserve and trying to encourage those relationships rather than trying to accelerate any tension.
Okay, great. I have another question. The question is, as an undergrad student, how should I ask a professor for an opportunity to do research with them?
So that's a great question, and it is also a very good practice to be able to approach a faculty member to talk about that. In a couple of different strategies that are helpful to help a student feel more comfortable to do that, or to improve the likelihood that that outreach would lead to a good opportunity or lead to a research partnership. If a student has taken any sort of coursework that would be helpful in conducting that sort of research, it would be helpful to mention that, to say, I've taken a couple of courses on this specific research method, so I have some familiarity with doing this, or here is a potential question or potential topic. I've taken this course to learn more about this topic. I'm interested in learning more. Faculty members are not going to expect that students are already experts, but if a student can demonstrate they've had some coursework, have had some exposure, and have an interest in learning more, I think that's something that faculty members would be very receptive to. Another sort of strategy or tactic that could be helpful, and if this is legitimately true, and if this is an interest of the students, to look at the kinds of projects or the kinds of writing that different faculty members do and say, I've seen that you've published a paper on this topic, or I see you do research in this area, and I'm interested in learning more about this. I'm interested in learning more about this kind of research. Can we talk more about this, or do you have opportunities for a student to get involved? I think most faculty members would be receptive to that, and again, wouldn't expect students already to be experts, but would appreciate that kind of interest in a common topic and would look for opportunities for students to make a contribution or have a learning experience.
Mm-hmm. All right. Dr. Hughes, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing so much useful information for our students. 那么希望今天的讲座可以帮助相关领域、相关专业的同学们找到自己的实习和职业方向，能够在即将开始的毕业季里有充分的准备，戎装上阵。Dr. Hughes, thank you again. We will talk to you soon. Have a good night. And 各位同学们，今天的讲座就到这里。祝大家新年快乐，学业事业有成。咱们下期讲座再见。